The kingdom of Solmir shone under bright morning light. The skies were always clean and wide, and the wind moved softly across the hills. Farmers worked in the golden fields, children played beside quiet rivers, and the towers of the royal castle glowed like white stone lanterns at sunrise. From a distance it seemed peaceful, but peace can hide pain. Inside the castle, Queen Eleanor carried a sadness that no crown could cover. 6 years had passed since her daughter, Princess Ilaria, disappeared. It had happened on the night of storms, when the royal carriage was traveling through the northern forest. Guards found broken wheels, torn banners, and tracks washed away by rain, but no trace of the princess. Some said bandits took her. Others whispered about wild lands beyond the border. The queen never gave up searching. She sent soldiers, riders, even scholars with maps and spyglasses. None returned with good news. Every morning, Queen Eleanor stood at her window to watch the sun rise, because her daughter had once loved the morning. Sometimes she thought she could hear that small, bright laugh echoing down the halls. But it was only wind, moving through cold stone corridors. Ministers came with questions about trade and law, but she spoke to them with the careful, dull voice of someone who remembered what joy used to sound like. In the border town of Grenfell, far from the castle, a man named Ethan worked as a mechanic. He once served as a soldier, but war had no place in his heart anymore. He had strong hands, rough from years of metal and fire, and a calm mind that solved problems others ran from. He was known for mending things tools, carts, even clockwork toys for children who could not afford new ones. Ethan believed humans were meant to build, not destroy. That belief was his only treasure. One quiet night, while walking back from the trade market, Ethan noticed a small silver pendant lying on a vendor's table. It caught the light strangely, as if light preferred that piece of silver more than any other. The vendor said it had come from an old chest found by travelers in the hills. Ethan lifted it gently. The front was shaped like a sun, with 8 rays. He wiped the surface and saw tiny letters around the edge. Somers Royal. Crest. Inside was a miniature portrait of a girl, painted with care. He remembered being a soldier guarding the castle gates when he was younger. He had seen the queen once, holding her little daughter during a street festival. That child's smile was burned in his memory. Now the same smile looked back from the pendant, though aged by time. His heart began to pound. He asked the vendor where it had been found, and the man shrugged. Northern hills, near the old mines, he said. Found it among old things buried in the dirt? Ethan felt the world shift around him. The pendant was not just a relic, it was a sign. Someone had carried it far from the palace, someone still alive. That night Ethan could not sleep. The moonlight fell through his window, touching the pendant on his table. It seemed to whisper a promise. Asterisk, she lives. Asterisk, he thought of the queen waiting for hope that never came, and of a child who might still be out there, trapped between danger and dreams. By morning, Ethan had made his choice. He packed tools, a small compass, bread, and clean water. He left a short note on his workshop table for his friends, gone north. To find what should never have been lost? Then he walked out as the sun rose. The road north was long and mostly empty. Ethan passed quiet farms, old shrines, and the ruins of lookout towers from forgotten wars. When he stopped to rest, he often looked at the pendant and wondered what voice it might still carry. Somewhere it had been dropped by small, trembling hands. Now he would follow its trail. He helped strangers along the way. When he found a broken wagon, he fixed it. When travelers were lost, he drew simple maps for them from memory. His kindness earned him food and shelter when supplies grew thin. Every act reminded him of why he had begun the journey, to prove that simple human courage still mattered. One night he camped in the valley near the gray mountains. The air was cool, and stars spread across the sky like burning seeds. He turned the pendant in his hand and thought of Queen Eleanor, sitting alone in her silent castle. He imagined her face if he could one day bring back her lost child. The picture burned brighter than the stars above him. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, Ethan smiled. Tomorrow, he would climb the mountains, follow any sign or story that might lead him to her. Somewhere beyond those peaks, hope was waiting. And even if the road demanded every drop of his strength, he was ready to give it. Ethan woke early, before the sun reached the valley. The air was cold and sharp. He packed his small bag, cleaned the dust from his boots, and held the silver pendant for courage. The metal was smooth from his touch, as if it remembered each moment of his journey. He looked toward the dark gray mountains stretching ahead. They seemed endless, but his mind was calm. Somewhere beyond them, he believed, waited the answer to 6 years of sorrow. He began to climb. The path twisted like a thin thread between cliffs and deep shadows. Once, these mountains had been full of miners and traders. Now they were silent, filled with the whisper of wind and the cry of distant birds. Ethan could see broken tools half buried in the soil and rail tracks eaten by rust. It felt as if the mountains had swallowed every dream that once lived here. By noon, he reached a narrow pass. There he met a woman resting beside an empty fire pit. She had short, dark hair and a strong, serious face. A long knife hung from her belt, but she looked tired rather than dangerous. When she saw Ethan approach, she stood and placed her hand on the hilt, watching him carefully. Ethan raised an open hand. "I am only passing through," he said. The woman studied him a moment, then nodded. "You are far from any town," she said. "What are you looking for in these hills?" Ethan hesitated. People laughed at stories of the lost princess. Still, her eyes seemed honest. "I am searching for someone," he said quietly. Then he showed her the pendant. She stared at it with wide eyes. For a second, her face softened. She reached out, then stopped herself. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From a trader," Ethan answered. "We found it near the old mines." The woman looked away, toward the dark ridge above them. "That place is dangerous," she said. "Few go there now, but I remember that crest. I was once a guard in the Queen's service." Before the night of storms, Ethan's heart quickened. "You knew her?" "I helped search for her," she said. "We found nothing. The Queen dismissed most of us after that." "My name is Mara." Ethan told her everything, how he found the pendant, and how he believed the princess might still be alive. At first Mara said nothing. Then she breathed deeply and picked up her pack. "If she is alive, someone must have kept her hidden. We will need to move carefully." "I will go with you," she said simply. Together they followed the old miner's path toward the heart of the mountains. The air grew heavier as they climbed. Stone walls pressed close on either side, and the light thinned to a dull blue. Soon they found signs that others might still live here. Footprints in the dust, faint glimmers of torchlight far inside. At night they camped near an old wooden bridge. Mara cleaned her knife while Ethan repaired a broken lantern using wire and glass from his pack. She watched him with quiet respect. "You still build things, even out here," she said. "It helps me think," he answered. "Machines are simple, people are harder." She smiled faintly. "That is true." The next morning, they reached a sealed passage, carved into the mountainside. Thick doors blocked the way, half covered by rockfalls. Ethan studied the edges and found thin gaps where air moved through. "Someone lives beyond this," he said. "These doors are old, but not dead." With tools and strength, they worked until sundown. At last, the doors opened with a harsh metallic groan. A gust of stale air escaped, carrying the smell of smoke and oil. Inside were long tunnels lit by hanging lamps. The walls glittered with veins of crystal. Deep echoes suggested moving machines and the sound of many feet. They hid behind a pillar and watched. Workers in rough clothes carried stones and pushed heavy carts. Some looked sick, some frightened. Among them walked a tall man with a whip who barked orders. Ethan's fists tightened. "Slaves," he whispered. Mara nodded grimly. This was once a mining colony. It seems someone has revived it for their own greed. They moved deeper, careful not to be seen. After a long walk, they reached a smaller chamber. In one corner, a group of young workers rested near a broken machine. Ethan noticed one girl sitting apart from the others. Her face was pale, but her eyes glowed with quiet strength. Round her neck shone a chain broken at the edge. It looked as if a locket had once hung there. Ethan's breath caught, even covered in dust. He knew that face. The painting in his pocket seemed to breathe again. He turned slowly to Mara. She had already recognized the same thing. "It is her," Mara whispered. For a moment they could not move. The girl turned her head toward them, as if she had felt their stare. Ethan stepped back into the shadows. Princess Ilaria was alive, but so far from safety that even hope felt dangerous. Mara touched his arm. "We cannot rush. We must plan." Ethan nodded. His heart was pounding. He could see her hands, thin and strong, working quietly to help another worker. The small kindness in that gesture showed that, even after years of darkness, her spirit was still her own. That night, Ethan and Mara hid in a narrow side tunnel. The air was cold and heavy with dust. They spoke in low voices, shaping a plan. Tomorrow, when the morning horn sounded and work began again, they would find a way to reach her. Ethan held the pendant once more. It caught the faint shine of the crystal light. "Hold on, Princess," he whispered into the dark. "We are here now." The mountain gave no answer, but somewhere deep inside it felt as if the stone itself had started to remember her name. Darkness filled the tunnels as the long night dragged on. Ethan and Mara sat close to the stone wall, watching the narrow passage that led to the working chambers. Faint orange light came through cracks in the rock. The hum of machines never stopped. Chains clinked. Voices murmured, low and tired. The people trapped there spoke little, saving what little strength they had. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he cleaned the dirt from his tools. Mara studied him with calm eyes. "We must be careful," she said quietly. "One wrong move, and they will lock us inside forever." He nodded. "We cannot leave her here, Mara. I saw her eyes. She is alive. She knows who she is." Mara pulled a small map from her coat, drawn roughly on old cloth. She had been here years ago when the mines still belonged to the Crown. "There is a lift deeper inside," she explained. "It was used to move heavy loads to the surface. If we can reach it, we can bring her out." Ethan looked at the tunnels again. Guards stood at corners, each carrying a torch and a blade. The lift must have been heavily watched. They needed a distraction big enough to draw the guards away. He touched the pouch at his side and felt the smooth pieces of metal he had collected along the path. His mind began to race with ideas. When morning came, the workers were called by the horn. The sound was harsh and long, echoing through every corridor. Ethan and Mara mixed with them, pretending to belong. Their faces were covered in dust, their clothes torn. It worked. No one looked twice. The overseer shouted orders. Cathan kept his head down and followed the others to the main hall. He looked quickly toward the young girl again. Princess Ilaria was already at work, carrying stones in a basket too heavy for her small frame, yet she did not complain. When another worker fell, she helped him up, even though the guards yelled at her for slowing down. Her gentle heart had not been broken. During the lunch period, while the guards rested near the fire, Ethan moved closer to her. He dropped a small piece of metal beside her and whispered, "Stay brave. We're here for you." Her hands froze for a second, and her eyes lifted to meet his. She did not speak, only gave the smallest nod. Then she turned back to her work, as though nothing had happened. That night, Ethan and Mara returned to their hiding place and built a small device out of spare parts-thin wires. A broken gear, and the power crystal Ethan had found in a fallen lamp. It was a kind of spark engine, something he had used once to move heavy wheels. If it worked, it could start a fire in the lower tunnels. That would cause confusion, and they could use the lift while the guards tried to control it. It took them hours. Mara watched the tunnels, breathing quietly as he worked. When the last piece clicked into place, Ethan whispered, "It will hold for a few seconds. That's all we need." The next day passed slowly. The tunnels were hotter than ever, filled with thick smoke from the machines. By nightfall, Ethan and Mara moved silently into the storage chamber below the work area. They placed the small engine near a pile of empty barrels and waited. When the crystal inside began to glow, they hurried away. Moments later, a loud crack shook the air, followed by smoke and firelight dancing on the walls. Guards began to shout, whistles blew, the workers screamed and ran. Ethan and Mara rushed to the main hall as flames spread through broken pipes. Ilaria stood frozen at first, not knowing where to go. Ethan grabbed her hand. "This way," shouted. She hesitated, recognizing his voice from the day before. Then she followed, running through the noise and confusion. Mara led them down the nearest passage. Behind them, a beam of wood fell and blocked the tunnel, trapping the guards on the other side. The three of them climbed the steep stairs toward the lift chamber. Smoke filled the air, and the heat burned their lungs, but they kept going. Ethan pulled the lever of the old lift, praying it would still work. The gears groaned, long unused, but then they began to move. The platform shook as it rose. Through small holes in the roof, they could see flashes of light and falling sparks. Mara coughed, but kept her sword ready. Ethan held Illyria's hand tightly. When the lift finally reached the surface, cool air hit their faces. Night had fallen again, and the sky above the mountains glittered with stars. They stumbled out onto rocky ground, gasping for breath. From below came the screams of guards trying to chase them, but the tunnel had collapsed behind them. Ethan looked at the girl he had saved. Her face was covered in dust, but her eyes shone with something fearless. She looked back at him and said softly, "You came for me." He smiled, though his chest still burned from the smoke. "Your mother never stopped believing you were alive." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Mara leaned against a rock, wounded from a falling stone, but her smile was proud. "We did it," she whispered. "Now we have to take her home." All three stood under the night sky, breathing hard. Far below, the fires of the ruined mine flickered like dying stars. For Ethan, the journey had only begun, but in that moment he knew one truth: the human heart, once set on a promise, could make light even in the deepest dark. The wind on the mountain was cold and sharp. Ethan, Mara, and Illyria stood under the open sky, breathing the free air for the first time in many days. The stars looked close, as if they had been waiting for her to return. Illyria lifted her face and closed her eyes. She whispered a quiet thank you to the night. She felt weak from hunger and fear, but her spirit was stronger than before. Ethan looked at the path that curved down the slope toward the valley. "We go south," he said. "There are villages near the foothills. We can find food and rest there." Mara nodded. Her shoulder was bleeding, and she held it with one hand, trying not to wince. "We have to keep moving before dawn," she said. "They will come after us once they clear the tunnels." Illyria glanced at her worriedly. "You are hurt," she said. Mara smiled a little. "I have had worse. Let us walk while we can." The three of them began the long journey down the mountain. The ground was rough, their steps slow. Ethan kept checking behind them, making sure no one followed. As they walked, Illyria told them what life had been like in the dark mine. She had been taken when she was 12, forced to work under watch and threat. The other prisoners had become her family. Over the years, she learned to read the moods of the guards and to help the weaker workers survive. Ethan listened in silence, feeling a deep respect grow in his heart. "The Queen never stopped searching for you," he said softly. "She sent riders for years, even into snow and storm." Illyria looked down. "Then I must not waste what she gave. I will not let her sorrow be for nothing." By the second day, Mara could walk no more. Her wound had grown worse. They found an old cabin near the forest line and stopped there to rest. Ethan boiled water and tore strips from his own shirt to bandage her shoulder. He worked quietly, his brow furrowed in worry. Illyria watched him, amazed by his patience. "You build, you heal, and you lead," she said gently. "You are unlike the men who ruled that mine." Ethan smiled faintly. "I am not a ruler, just a man who believes people can do better." Mara laughed weakly. "That belief has kept us alive, friend." They stayed in the cabin 2 nights. Ethan left at dawn each morning to hunt for food and returned with fruits and small game. Illyria cleaned the cabin and made a soft bed for Mara. On the 3rd morning, Mara insisted they move again. The Queen's lands were still many miles away, and time could not be wasted. They followed an old river trail. Trees grew thick along both sides, and sunlight fell through the leaves in broken gold. For a while they could almost forget the danger behind them. Birds sang, and the sound of the water felt like peace. But peace never lasted long in such times. Late that evening, when they reached an open clearing, they heard the sound of horses behind them. Riders, sharp and fast. Mara's eyes widened. "They have found us." Ethan looked around quickly. "There is a bridge ahead," he said, "made of rope and wood. Once we cross it, we can cut it down." They ran. The riders shouted as they closed the distance. Hoofs pounded like thunder. Illyria's breath caught as she clutched the pendant in fear. Ethan pulled her across the bridge first, the old ropes creaking under their weight. Mara crossed behind them, half limping, half running. When all three reached the far side, Ethan drew his knife and cut the rope. The bridge tore loose and swung into the canyon. The riders stopped at the edge, shouting in anger. The echo faded, and only the sound of the river far below remained. They walked until night fell again, then found a safe hiding place between two large rocks. They lit no fire, speaking only in whispers. Ilaria looked up at the stars and said quietly, "If we make it home, I will tell the entire kingdom what you did. Everyone must know what courage looks like." Ethan smiled at her words. "Courage is something that lives in quiet hearts," he said. "You have it as much as anyone." Mara closed her eyes, her voice soft but steady. "The queen deserves to hold her daughter again. That thought is enough." When morning came, they reached the green plains. The castle of Solmir was still far away, but Ilaria could already imagine the tall towers shining in the sun. Her heart lifted with each step. The scent of grass and wildflowers filled the air. They rested near an old stone gate, where they met a group of farmers. The farmers gave them bread and warm milk when Ethan told them who the young woman was. None could believe their eyes at first, but then they bowed in silence. One of them whispered, "The lost princess returns." Word began to spread from farm to farm faster than fire and dry grass. By the next afternoon, everywhere they passed, people came out to see the girl who had been lost for so long. Some knelt, others cried, and all cheered when she smiled shyly at them. At last, the towers of Solmir appeared on the horizon. The evening sun made them shine like gold. Ilaria stopped and looked at Ethan and Mara. "You both risked your lives to bring me home," she said. "I will never forget." Ethan looked at her gently, then walked forward for every person who ever waited for hope. Together, they began the last climb toward the city gates. Unaware that behind those walls, Queen Eleanor was about to see her world change forever. Evening covered the city of Solmir as the three travelers reached the wide stone road leading to the royal gates. The sky glowed soft orange, and the flags on the towers waved gently in the evening wind. It had been a long journey, filled with danger and pain, but now the walls that once seemed far as a dream stood close enough to touch. Guards at the gate stepped forward, crossing their spears. One of them called, "State your names and purpose." His tone was firm but polite. Ethan stepped ahead, dust covering his clothes and face. "We come from the northern mountains," he said. "I bring the queen her daughter." The guards frowned in confusion, ready to question him again. But then Ilaria stepped beside Ethan. The fading sunlight touched her face, and for a moment the air went still. One guard gasped. "It cannot be," he whispered. "The princess." Another guard dropped his spear and bowed deeply. "Open the gates," he shouted. Bells began to ring from the nearest tower. The sound spread through the city like a wave, catching the ears of every passerby. Shopkeepers left their stalls, mothers turned from cooking, children ran into the streets. The news moved faster than words could travel. The lost princess had returned. As Ethan, Mara, and Ilaria walked through the streets, people followed them, their voices full of awe. Some cried, others smiled through their tears. Old women threw flower petals from windows, and young men shouted praises. Ilaria looked around, dazed but smiling. Her eyes grew wet, not from fear, but from joy she could hardly hold. Inside the castle, Queen Eleanor was meeting her council. She stopped speaking when she heard the bells. The sound came once, twice, 3 times, then again and again. Her heart froze. No bell had rung in that pattern since the day her daughter vanished. It was the sound reserved only for royal return. She stood and ran, not caring that her crown slipped from her hair. Through the grand halls she went, her footsteps echoing fast upon the marble floor. Servants bowed as she passed, their faces filled with joy. When she reached the main doors, she saw the crowd gathered in the courtyard and the 3 figures standing among them. Ilaria stepped forward slowly. For a moment, mother and daughter could only stare at each other, both afraid the vision before them might disappear. Then the queen gave a choked cry and rushed forward. She caught her daughter in her arms and held her tightly, folding years of pain into that one moment. No one in the crowd spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop to watch. When the queen finally looked up, her eyes were full of tears, her face shining with the warm light of sunset. She looked at Ethan, who stood a few steps away, hands clasped before him. "You brought her back to me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "The kingdom owes you everything." Ethan bowed his head. "She was brave long before I found her," he said, "only followed the promise of hope. Mara stood nearby, her arm still in a sling. The queen turned to her and said, "You've protected my child. You have my endless gratitude." Mara smiled faintly. "The light of Salmir should never go out," she said. "Now it shines again." That night the city came alive with celebration. Fires burned in the squares, music filled the streets, and laughter rose to the stars. Ethan watched from a quiet corner near the courtyard. He held the silver pendant that had begun his journey. The portrait inside still smiled. Now, no longer a memory, but part of a living story. Queen Eleanor found him standing alone. She walked to his side. No crown, no guards, just a mother who had found her child. "You could have taken gold or land," she said, "but I sense those things mean little to you. What shall I give you?" Ethan looked up at the castle, where Ilaria was laughing with the servants, her eyes brighter than any jewel. "Just promise me this," he said. "Teach every child in this kingdom that courage and kindness can change the world. That is enough for me." The queen nodded slowly, touched by his words. "Then you have given me something greater than any treasure. You reminded me what makes us human." Months passed, and peace returned to Salmir. The mines were sealed, their masters gone. Freedom spread through the valleys, and stories of the brave engineer and the rescued princess traveled far beyond the borders. Ethan built a workshop near the capital where he taught young people how to create machines that helped farmers and healers. Mara stayed by his side for a time, helping him train others before she moved north again to rebuild her old village. Princess Ilaria spent her days studying with scholars and her nights visiting Ethan's workshop, learning to build and mend. The two often talked about their journey, the fear, the friendship, and the courage that had guided them. She grew stronger, wiser, and more curious about the world beyond the palace walls. The queen watched proudly, knowing her daughter had inherited not only royal blood but also the humble heart of those who had saved her. One evening, as the sun painted the land in gold, the queen stood on her balcony. She looked down and saw Ethan and Ilaria working together below, their laughter rising softly with the evening breeze. Her eyes filled with tears again, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were the bright and gentle tears of gratitude, the tears of a mother who had regained what she had lost, seen goodness restored to her world. And as the stars began to appear above the quiet kingdom, the queen knew that hope, once given shape by a single human heart, could never fade again.